The casserole dish slipped from her hands and shattered across the kitchen floor, ceramic shards skidding in every direction, cheese and glass mixing in a humiliating mess. Her son didn't flinch. He barely looked up from his phone. "You should have just ordered something. This is why I said not to bother," he muttered, tone flat, more annoyed than concerned. She stood frozen, hands trembling, heart pounding in her ears. She had spent the entire morning making that meal, his favorite, or at least it used to be. The recipe card had been pulled from a faded box of handwritten notes, stained and curled from decades of use. Now it lay useless, just like she felt, in that moment, beneath the cold, fluorescent kitchen light. His wife walked in, eyebrows arched, lips tight. "Maybe next time just sit and relax, Mom. Honestly, it's more work cleaning up after you." The words stung worse than the thin cut blooming on her palm from a piece of the broken dish. She looked at her son, hoping for even a flicker of defense, a flash of the boy who used to cry when she got a paper cut. But he just turned his back, muttering something about work emails, and left the room. Her knees felt weak, but she didn't sit down. Not yet. The silence that filled the space was suffocating, not peaceful, not restful, just loud with everything unspoken. Her suitcase still sat by the door, unopened, a sad reminder that she wasn't a guest, but a leftover responsibility no one knew where to store. She had arrived only 2 days ago, invited after her hip surgery with promises of recovery, family, time, a place to heal. But now she realized she hadn't been invited out of love. She had been absorbed out of guilt, a fixture, a burden, an obligation. Her hand bled quietly onto the countertop as she picked up the first shard, every motion deliberate, mechanical, like muscle memory in a body no one needed anymore. How had she gone from being everything to being invisible? When had her sacrifices become background noise? She didn't cry, not yet. But something deep inside her cracked with the dish, something that wouldn't be glued back together. She hadn't always been invisible. There was a time when every small decision she made rippled out into someone else's future. A time when being needed wasn't just her role, it was her reason for breathing. She married young, to a man who worked with his hands and made her laugh with his eyes. Their home was modest but warm, full of second-hand furniture, handwritten labels on jars, and dreams stacked higher than the bills they couldn't always pay. When their son was born, he came into the world screaming with life, a red-faced reminder that love could be loud, demanding, and all-consuming. She didn't mind the sleepless nights, the spit-up on her blouses, the loneliness that sometimes crept in when her husband's shifts ran too long. She was a mother now. She had found her purpose. And when her husband died suddenly, an aneurysm, they said, something silent and swift, she didn't crumble. She couldn't. She had a 7-year-old with big eyes and no understanding of what forever really meant. So she dried her tears, took a night job cleaning offices, and spent her days folding laundry with one hand while helping with homework with the other. She put off everything she had once dreamed for herself, night classes, travel, even the garden she had always wanted. There was no room for her in the life she had to hold together. She missed birthdays, her own. She missed doctor appointments, hers. She missed sleep, joy, companionship. But she never missed a parent-teacher meeting, a packed lunch, or a single Saturday soccer game, even if she had to go straight from a shift still smelling of cleaning fluid and exhaustion. Her son used to run into her arms after school, his voice filled with stories and questions. "Did you see me score that goal, Mom? Can we make pancakes for dinner again?" He used to say, "I love you," 10 times a day. She carried that love like armor, protecting herself from the crushing weight of loneliness. She never remarried. There was never time. By the time he was in college, she had taken on extra shifts to help pay his rent. When he got married, she dipped into her retirement savings to pay for the down payment on their first house. His house, her sacrifice. And when the grandkids came, she moved closer, offered free babysitting, school pickups, homemade dinners. They called her Grandma, with sticky fingers and tired eyes, and she didn't mind when her hands ached from holding them for too long. That ache, at least, meant something. It meant she was still necessary. But over time, the phone calls grew shorter, the visits less frequent. She would sit in her small apartment, baking a casserole for a dinner she hadn't been invited to, knitting scarves for birthdays she wasn't sure they'd remember. Her son would say things like, "You really don't have to fuss," and "Why don't you just rest for once?" As though rest was a gift she had been waiting her whole life to receive. It wasn't that they were cruel. No, that would be easier to define. It was something quieter, subtler. The slow fade of appreciation into assumption. Her love became background noise, expected, unseen. She had once been the sun in their sky, and now she was the porch light they forgot to switch on. But it hadn't always been this way. And maybe that's what hurt the most, that she had once been everything, and now she felt like nothing. She had just finished folding the laundry, his shirts, his children's pajamas, the socks that always seemed to vanish. In pairs, when she heard the front door open and unfamiliar voices echo down the hallway. She stepped out of the guest room, wiping her hands on her apron, expecting to see her son or the kids. Instead, a woman stood in the living room, mid-20s, sleek ponytail, clipboard in hand, laughing softly as she shook hands with her daughter-in-law. A stranger, smiling, confident, comfortable. Her son walked in moments later, nodding politely to the woman as she took a seat on the couch, the very spot where she used to knit while waiting for the kids to come home from school. The woman pulled a small folder from her bag, began talking about schedules, routines, allergies. The words didn't make sense at first. Something about early pickups, meal prep, nap time. It wasn't until the woman said, "I'm so excited to be starting this journey with your family," that the pieces began to snap into place like broken glass finding a cruel new shape. She stood silently, frozen just beyond the archway, her presence unnoticed, or worse, ignored. Her daughter-in-law glanced up. "Oh, Mom, you're home. This is Amanda. She'll be helping out with the kids from now on." There was a pause, but not the kind that invites explanation. Just silence, like a door softly locking. Her son, without meeting her eyes, added, "We thought it might be time for someone younger, someone who can keep up with everything. You've done more than enough, Mom." The words echoed, more than enough. They stung not because they were cruel, but because they were final. She looked around the room and noticed things that hadn't caught her eye before. The absence of her knitting basket, the missing family photo that used to sit on the mantel, the blanket she had crocheted for the kids now folded neatly in a storage bin, little erasures, slow deletions of a woman who once meant everything here. She didn't say a word. Not then. Not when they showed Amanda the kids' favorite snacks, or when her granddaughter ran up and hugged the nanny's legs like they were already familiar. She simply turned, returned to the guest room, and closed the door softly behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed, the clean laundry still in her hands, now damp from the sweat in her palms. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears, louder than the children's laughter in the next room. They hadn't told her. They hadn't even warned her. They had made the decision, planned it, and brought someone in, all while she was under their roof, folding their clothes, baking their dinners, pretending she was still needed. It wasn't just the hiring. It was the message written between every gesture. You are no longer part of this story. But she didn't cry. Not yet. Her world had tilted, the ground beneath her cracked open, but she sat in the quiet, holding. Her breath letting the pain settle like dust before the wind. The days blurred into one another like smudged ink on a page, silent, slow, and utterly vacant. At first, she held on to hope like a thread, thinking maybe the decision to hire the nanny was temporary, maybe just for a few weeks while things settled. But the weeks turned to months, and she was never asked to babysit again. The calls dwindled. At first, they came with awkward apologies and excuses. "We're just so busy lately, Mom," or "You deserve to rest." Then they stopped entirely. Her phone sat on the kitchen counter like a relic, the screen dim and lifeless, save for the occasional spam call or pharmacy reminder. Her messages went unanswered. Photos of the kids, once sent regularly with updates and emojis, disappeared. She checked her social media and saw the life she was no longer a part of. A birthday party she hadn't been invited to. Her grandson beaming behind a cake she hadn't baked. Her granddaughter in a new dress she didn't buy, standing next. To Amanda, the nanny, who now appeared in more family photos than she ever had. She spent her own birthday alone, a cupcake with a single candle placed carefully on her kitchen table. She lit it herself, whispered a wish she didn't believe in, and blew it out in the quiet. The walls of her apartment felt smaller, the silence sharper. She tried to stay busy, knit a scarf, start a puzzle, bake muffins no one would eat. But everything she did reminded her of who she used to be, of the life that had slipped through her fingers like water. The final blow came not from cruelty, but from formality. A letter in the mail from her son and daughter-in-law, delivered by courier. It was polite, professional, sterile. It thanked her for everything she had done, explained that moving forward, they'd prefer she call before stopping by, and included the contact information for a senior living facility nearby, just in case she wanted to explore other options. It wasn't just distancing, it was a declaration. You're not needed anymore, and your presence is inconvenient. She sat in her chair for hours that night, the letter unfolded in her lap, the lights off. Her hands lay still, palms open like she was waiting for something to be placed in them. A phone call, an apology, anything. But nothing came. Her world, once loud with laughter and movement and requests, had gone utterly still. She walked past the old bedroom she'd prepared for the grandkids, twin beds, storybooks still stacked neatly, and closed the door gently, sealing it like a tomb. Even loneliness began to feel like company. At least it was something. She hadn't opened the bottom drawer of her old writing desk in years. It was the one filled with clutter. Rubber bands, empty envelopes, faded receipts, and things she no longer had the heart or energy to throw away. But on that gray morning, when the silence of her apartment felt especially suffocating and her hands itched for purpose, she decided to clean it out. What she found instead was a folded manila envelope, worn at the edges, her name scrawled in, her husband's handwriting across the front. Her breath caught. It had been nearly 20 years since he passed, and yet seeing that familiar, looping script was like being touched by a ghost she hadn't known she missed so desperately. She sat down at the desk, placed the envelope gently in front of her, and opened it with hands she tried to keep steady. Inside was a copy of their joint savings certificate from decades ago and, what made her freeze, a deed. Land. A small piece. Of property in Vermont they had inherited from his grandfather but never touched. Back then, life had moved too quickly, expenses piled up too high, and the land had become just another thing she promised to deal with someday. But here it was, in her name. Untouched, unclaimed. Her heart pounded, not with hope, not yet, but with the stirring of possibility. Beneath the deed, she found something else, a letter, dated just 6 months before his death. She unfolded it slowly. His voice, so long silenced, seemed to rise off the page. If you're reading this, it means, life didn't go the way we planned. I know you're strong. You always were. Take care of our boy, but don't forget to take care of you. That land is yours. Do something with it. Something just for you. You've earned that much and more. She read it again, and again, until her tears blurred the words. Not from sorrow this time, but from something steadier, recognition. For so long, her life had been defined by what she gave up. Now, here was something she still had. Not a memory, not a role, not a favor waiting to be returned. It was hers, and it was enough to begin again. Her sorrow didn't vanish. It receded, like a tide making room for something new. A different kind of silence filled the apartment now, one that didn't feel like punishment, one that felt like preparation. The snow had barely melted from the sidewalks when she stepped off the city bus, clutching a worn leather purse that suddenly felt like a vault. She walked with her scarf drawn tightly around her neck, not from the cold, but from the newness of the silence inside her, a quiet that didn't sting like it used to. It was a new kind of stillness, deliberate and potent. For the first time in years, her steps had direction. She pushed open the glass door to the law office, her fingers pausing just briefly on the brass handle. Inside, it smelled of old paper and fresh coffee. The receptionist, young and distracted, barely looked up. But that was fine. She wasn't here to be seen. Not yet. Lorraine, her friend from long ago and retired family lawyer, greeted her with that same steady smile she always had at church gatherings. They hadn't spoken much since the funeral all those years ago, but some friendships live in a drawer. Quiet until needed, still sharp. Over tea and a stack of yellowing documents, Lorraine helped her unearth what she still owned. A small savings account, a share in a forgotten municipal bond, and most importantly, that deed. The land in Vermont, untouched, unbothered, entirely hers. She had no idea its value had grown so substantially in the years since it was last appraised. Developers had been eyeing the area for lakeside vacation homes. That plot of land, overlooked and humble, had become a rare gem. The number Lorraine circled on the valuation form nearly made her laugh. Not because of the money, but because of the irony. All these years being treated like she had nothing left, and here she was, holding the kind of leverage no one saw coming. She didn't rush, no grand moves. She consulted another attorney, opened a separate bank account under her full legal name. No joint ownership, no contingencies, no shared access. She took meticulous notes, asked questions, and signed each paper with a calm hand and a steady gaze. The satisfaction didn't come from revenge, not yet. It came from remembering she had power, that she could take up space in her own life again. The will was next. Her old one had been written when her son was still calling her 3 times a week, and her grandchildren couldn't sleep without her goodnight songs. But those pages had turned brittle with time and betrayal. She sat at Lorraine's desk and rewrote every line. Her son's name was removed, completely. No inheritance, no executorship, nothing. Not out of cruelty, but clarity. He had forfeited the right to her legacy the moment he treated her like an inconvenience. The money, the property, the modest estate that would now grow from her land sale. It was all redirected. Half to a nonprofit women's shelter, the kind that offered beds and warm meals to women with nowhere to go. The other half to a local daycare run by retired teachers serving young single mothers trying to hold their lives together with 2. Little and too late. She knew those women. She had been them, in every form. Her eyes welled as she signed the final clause, in honor of every woman who gave everything and was left with nothing. She didn't tell anyone. That was the power of it, the beauty. While her son scrolled through social media posts and posted weekend photos with his modern family, while his wife bragged to neighbors about Amanda's perfect routines and structured meal plans, she was laying bricks beneath her own future, one that didn't include them. She sold the land 2 weeks later, discreetly. The check was wired, the account established, and a small sum withdrawn in cash. Enough to pay the deposit on the lake cottage she had bookmarked months earlier, but never believed she'd actually claim. The listing agent met her at the edge of the gravel driveway. The house was modest, but full of charm. 2 bedrooms, a wide porch, ivy crawling up the left side like an embrace. Inside, the wooden floors creaked under her feet, in a way that felt honest. She signed the paperwork on a Tuesday morning. By Friday, it was hers, just hers. No shared titles, no backup contact, no emergency listing with her son's name. She arranged the move quietly, packing only what she needed: a few boxes, her late husband's letters, her knitting bag, and one faded photo of her young son before the distance crept in. Before she left, she returned once, not for a confrontation, but for closure. Her old apartment key still hung on the rack by her son's garage door, the one nobody had bothered to remove. She let herself in while they were at brunch, Amanda likely overseeing the morning routine. The house felt sterile, staged, like a home designed to look like love rather than live in it. Her old slippers were gone. The blanket she had made had been folded tightly into a storage bin in the hall closet. There was no trace of her, and that was fine. She walked into the kitchen, pulled a pen from her purse, and wrote a note on a plain piece of paper she found on the counter. No frills, no guilt, just truth. I've decided to go somewhere I'm wanted, somewhere I can breathe. You said I should rest. I'm doing that now, on my terms. I won't be needing the apartment anymore. She placed the envelope next to her, key, and turned to leave. No tears, no lingering, just a quiet strength that filled the hallway as she walked away. It wasn't revenge that pulsed through her veins. It was resolution. She didn't scream. She didn't demand. She didn't beg. And yet, somehow, she had said everything that needed to be said. She didn't need to raise her voice to win. All she had to do was leave. It didn't happen all at once. No revenge worth savoring ever does. It unfolded slowly, elegantly, like a quiet unraveling of a lie that had worn its welcome. Her absence at first went unnoticed, or at least unspoken. The kids asked where Grandma was, but their parents responded with vague explanations. She needed rest, she's on a little trip, she'll be back soon. But weeks passed, then months. No visits, no baked goods, no folded laundry. Amanda, efficient and well-trained, began to feel like a stranger in the house, despite her flawless routines. Something was missing, something essential. That soft presence, the one who used to anticipate what everyone needed before they even knew to ask. The children became restless. Her granddaughter threw a tantrum one evening and screamed, "I want Grandma, not Amanda." Her son and daughter-in-law exchanged glances they didn't discuss aloud. They still hadn't heard from her. No texts, no calls. And when her daughter-in-law finally checked her voicemail out of curiosity, there were none from the woman they used to rely on daily. Just silence. It was in that silence that things began to shift. A thick white envelope arrived, by certified mail, addressed to her son, the name typed in sharp, professional font. Inside was a legal notice. The will had been formally revised and executed. He had been removed entirely. Executor status revoked, beneficiary rights revoked, all assets transferred. It was real, final, legal. His name wasn't even listed as a secondary contact. Instead, the beneficiaries included organizations he'd never heard of: a women's shelter, a daycare nonprofit, a community housing trust for elderly women facing homelessness. He reread the page over and over, looking for a loophole. A mistake, some small sign that he had misread the document, but the truth stood firm, brutal in its quiet finality. She had erased him. His hands shook as he placed the papers down, and then he noticed something even worse. Her savings account had been emptied. The joint emergency fund he assumed was dormant had been closed. The land she once told him was worth maybe a few thousand had been sold. He made a few frantic phone calls, only to discover that he had no legal access to anything. The family attorney confirmed the changes had all been processed months ago. "She did it right," the attorney said plainly. "Ironclad. Nothing you can contest." Word started to spread, not loudly but persistently, like whispers gathering weight. The neighbors noticed she no longer appeared at school pickups. One of the other mothers asked where she'd gone. "Vermont, I think," said her daughter-in-law weakly. She needed a break. But that explanation didn't hold when a mutual friend forwarded a link from a local Vermont newspaper. There, in the community spotlight section, was a photo of her, standing on the porch of a quaint lakeside cottage, sunlight pouring over her silver hair as she held a tray of baked goods. The caption read, "Retired Local Woman Fund's new daycare initiative for single mothers says it's never too late to give back." Her smile was real. Her hands looked strong. She stood surrounded by women, not family, but chosen community. They laughed together like old friends who had rediscovered joy not in what they lost, but in what they still had to build. Other photos surfaced, not ones she posted, but ones taken by others who met her. Her presence was magnetic, almost mythical. "That's the woman who walked away," someone said. "She gave her whole life to her family and then took it back." The story gained quiet traction. The retired mother who was cut out and then cut them out. Not with cruelty, but with precision. Not with vengeance, but with value. Back home, her daughter-in-law began to panic. Not about the money, though losing the inheritance hurt, but about the unraveling narrative. They had always painted her as forgetful, fragile, dependent. But now, strangers were calling her brilliant, empowered, inspirational, and worst of all, free. Her son tried calling. Once, twice, left a voicemail that started polite and ended pleading. "Mom, we miss you. The kids miss you. I didn't mean to..." He hung up before finishing. She never returned the call. She didn't need to. Her response had already been delivered, through lawyers, through ledgers, through locked doors. Her power wasn't in confrontation. It was in absence. And that absence began to haunt the home she'd once kept alive. The meals weren't as warm. The children were distant. Amanda eventually quit. "I'm not sure this is a good fit anymore," she said diplomatically. But the truth hung heavy between the lines. She wasn't their grandmother. She couldn't fill that space. Meanwhile, the cottage became a sanctuary, not just for her, but for others. Women came to her, quietly at first, sharing stories of abandonment, of invisibility, of exhaustion. She never offered pity. She offered space, a garden to tend, a meal to cook together, a soft chair by the fire. They called her Miss Eleanor, at first, but soon just Eleanor, or simply friend. Her Sundays were filled with shared dinners. Her mornings began with handwritten letters and fresh bread. No one demanded anything of her here. No one asked her to shrink herself for their convenience. The community respected her not because of what she had given, but because of what she had reclaimed. Her time, her name, her voice. Back in the city, her son paced the living room one night, holding the signed legal documents like they were an obituary. He had not just lost an inheritance. He had lost access. Lost the woman who had once held his world together with hands that never stopped, giving. And now, those hands were folded peacefully in her lap as she watched the sun rise over the lake, not a trace of regret in her eyes. Her revenge wasn't a scream. It wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't a spectacle. It was elegant. It was unshakable. It was the simple, powerful act of taking everything back without asking permission. It started with hesitation, an unsure ring of her phone on a Thursday afternoon that she let fade into silence. Unknown number, local area code. She didn't answer. Then came the messages, one from her son, one from his wife, both short, both brittle in their attempts to sound casual. "Hey, Mom, just wanted to check in. The kids were asking about you. We're all hoping you're doing okay. Let us know if you need anything." They didn't say they were sorry. Not yet. The first wave was about comfort, restoring, a sense of normalcy, slipping back into the old roles without having to acknowledge how they'd destroyed them. She sat on her back porch that evening, the sun painting long streaks across the lake, and listened to the wind rustle the trees. The phone buzzed on the table beside her. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look. Some silences are heavier than words. And this one, this silence, was the first she'd ever chosen entirely for herself. Not out of anger, not out of grief, but because she finally understood that she owed no one a response. A few days later came a letter, handwritten, which surprised her. Her son's script, still sharp and purposeful, just as it had been when he was a boy learning to form cursive loops on their old kitchen table. I made mistakes. I should have done more. I should have said thank you when you were still around. To hear it, I don't know how to make this right, but I want to. The letter was 4 pages long, a recounting of memories, a dozen attempts at justification disguised as explanations. There were mentions of stress, of parenting fatigue, of needing help and structure. He admitted they'd acted too quickly, without realizing what we were pushing away. There was even a line she read twice. "You were never the burden, Mom. You were the backbone." She folded the letter and placed it in the drawer by her bedside, nestled between her husband's old watch and a stack of postcards from Vermont bookstores. She didn't cry. She didn't smile either. She simply stared out the window as a breeze swept through the lace curtains and reminded herself, not every apology deserves a reply. Her daughter-in-law's tone took a different approach. The voicemails grew weepy, more dramatic. "I didn't mean to hurt you. We were overwhelmed. I thought I was doing what was best for everyone. You know how hard it is raising kids these days, don't you remember?" Eleanor, sitting in her garden and watching the beans climb their trellis, allowed herself the faintest sigh. Yes, she remembered. But what her daughter-in-law never seemed to grasp was that Eleanor had done it alone. No help, no nanny, no community centers or parenting blogs, just grit, exhaustion, and a bone-deep commitment to keep her family intact. She had bled for that family, sacrificed every quiet want and whispered dream. And yet, in the end, she had been dismissed like expired milk. The voicemails kept coming, some pleading, some irritated, one even angry. "I don't know what you want us to say. You can't just cut us off like this." But Eleanor had learned something they hadn't. Silence was not weakness. It was power. It was peace. It was her final word. What rattled them most wasn't the lack of communication. It was her joy. Her name began surfacing more frequently on social media, shared in photos by the women's shelter she'd funded, featured in a short article titled, "The Grandma Who Walked Away." Her smile in the pictures was unmistakable. It wasn't the polite, tight-lipped version they were used to seeing on family holidays. It was open, radiant, unbothered. She was seen walking hand in hand with a little girl who wasn't her granddaughter, reading books aloud to a circle of wide-eyed children who clung to every word like it was magic. A local photographer even posted a candid shot of her laughing so hard her head tilted back. A woman rediscovering joy after decades of swallowing her own voice. The public comments rolled in. "She's a hero. I wish my mom had done this. She looks like freedom." Her granddaughter sent a card. Crayons, stickers, glitter pressed into every corner. "I love you, Grandma. I miss you. Come back soon." Eleanor placed her knitting down slowly and turned the card in her hands, letting her fingers brush over the bumpy construction paper. She wrote back, just one sentence. "Love you always, Grandma." No return address, no questions, no invitations. Just love, because the child was innocent, still too young to know how adults let love rot in the corners of expectation. It wasn't the girl's fault, and Eleanor wouldn't make her pay the price for her parents' choices. There was a moment, one late evening, when Eleanor sat alone at her kitchen table and listened to the stillness wrap around her like a shawl. She thought about dialing his number, just to hear the voice that had once called her Mommy with such reverence. She thought about all the meals she'd cooked, all the nights she sat beside his bed when he was sick, all the dreams she'd let dissolve so his could bloom. But in that same moment, she remembered standing in his kitchen as her casserole shattered on the floor, remembered the way he didn't look up, didn't help, didn't care. That was her breaking point. And she had walked through it into something stronger. No, she didn't need to go back. She had a new life now, a fuller one. She spent her mornings tending her garden, her afternoons mentoring young mothers who reminded her of the woman she used to be, and her evenings writing letters, not to her past, but to women who might still be stuck in theirs. She never raised her voice, never slammed a door, never made a scene. And yet, in her silence, she had said the loudest thing of all. You don't get to discard me and then summon me when it's convenient. She had chosen herself, and she would do it again. They called, they emailed, they begged, but she never picked up. The lake was still that morning, the mist clinging to its surface like a secret. Eleanor stood barefoot on her porch, coffee warm, in her hands, watching the sky turn from gray to gold. There was no one waiting for her, no child tugging her sleeve, no list of tasks left undone. For years she had believed that her value came from being needed, being useful. But now, in this soft quiet, she felt whole for the first time in her life. She had begun to fill her days with small joys, tending to her herbs, walking the dirt, paths behind the cottage, sharing long talks with women who, like her, had once poured from empty cups. No one asked her for anything here, and still, she was loved. She had once thought being alone meant being forgotten. But solitude had become her sanctuary. In the mirror, she no longer saw a woman past her prime. She saw strength carved by years, dignity that had endured storms. She wasn't a burden. She never had been. She was the foundation they stood on, and now she was free to stand on her own. This time, there was no one to interrupt her, no eyes judging her hands as they served the meal, no voices muttering about forgetfulness or fragility. Just a single plate, a linen napkin folded with care, and the soft clink of silverware against porcelain. The scent of rosemary chicken filled the air, mingling with the breeze drifting in through the open window. She poured herself a glass of wine, lifted it in a quiet toast to the woman she had finally become, and smiled. This time, she ate at her table, alone and free.